And I'm standing right off behind the camera watching this going like, I'm right here, guys. Like, this is fucking terrible. Like, talk about it's surreal to watch your own face get ripped apart.
Chris Jericho has been one of the most entertaining wrestlers alive, but behind the curtain, there is a very different story. 10 wrestlers who shared a locker room with him will tell you that working with Jericho was not always fun. A nose-to-nose confrontation with Brock Lesnar, a hallway brawl with Goldberg, getting knocked out on a cruise ship. This is the real list of 10 wrestlers Chris Jericho hated. Jericho is talented. Few people in wrestling history have lasted as long or stayed as relevant, but drama followed this man everywhere he went. Sometimes he brought it on himself. If you love real backstage wrestling stories like this one, hit the hype feature and hype this video so more wrestling fans can find it. In professional wrestling, heat is a word that means real-life tension, not the scripted drama you see on television. Not the storyline where two characters pretend to despise each other to sell tickets. Real heat, the kind that follows people into hallways, hotel lobbies, and cruise ships. The kind that makes grown men who fake fights for a living actually start real ones. Chris Jericho has had more of that kind of heat than almost anyone in the modern era. He came up in the territory days where you had to earn respect with your fists as much as your footwork. He went to Mexico, he went to Japan, he climbed his way through the cruiserweight ranks of World Championship Wrestling and made himself impossible to ignore. He stormed into the World Wrestling Federation in 1999 with one of the greatest debut moments the company had ever produced and became one of the most famous names in the history of the sport. His career has lasted over 30 years, and he has reinvented himself more times than most performers get to try. But no matter where he went, conflict found him. Or rather, if you look closely enough, he found the conflict. That is the honest version of this story. Jericho has written about his career in great detail. He has books, he has a podcast, he has done more interviews than anyone can count. He is not shy about telling the world who rubbed him the wrong way, who stood in his path, and who made his professional life harder than it needed to be. He is a gifted storyteller. But if you look at the pattern across 30+ years of those stories, something becomes clear. Jericho had a way of turning small problems into personal wars. He positioned himself as the victim more often than not, and when someone challenged him, either creatively or physically, he treated it like a full-on declaration that needed to be answered loudly and publicly. In wrestling, you call it being a heat magnet. Some people just attract drama wherever they go. Jericho was one of the best in the business at wrestling. He was also one of the best at attracting drama. Heat in professional wrestling falls into a few categories. Sometimes it is territorial. The established performers do not want new arrivals taking their spots, so they make life difficult for anyone trying to climb. Sometimes it is creative. Two performers simply cannot agree on how a story should be told, and the disagreement slowly turns cold. Sometimes it gets physical. Someone throws a real punch or a real choke, and everything escalates from there very fast. And sometimes it is personal. The disagreement has nothing to do with wrestling at all. It is about something said on social media, or at a bar, or on a cruise ship floating in the middle of the ocean. Jericho has managed to hit every single one of those categories across his career. Not in the same confrontation, across multiple promotions, multiple countries, multiple decades. That is almost impressive when you think about it from a distance. We are going through 10 names, 10 wrestlers who, at one point or another, had real problems with Chris Jericho. For each one, there is a story, and for each one, if you look at it without the filter Jericho puts over it when he tells it himself, a pattern becomes very visible. Some of these stories ended in genuine reconciliation. Some of them still carry weight today. We are starting with the most recent story on this list, because it is close in time and it shows just how far things can escalate before two grown men finally decide to act like professionals. Number 10 is MVP. This one is different from most of the others on this list because it did not start in a wrestling ring. It did not begin over a championship match or a spot on the card or a creative disagreement about a finish. This one started on social media, which might be the most fitting origin story possible for a conflict involving Jericho, who has always had a great deal to say and has never struggled to find a platform to say it on. Jericho and MVP were once genuine friends. They had shared locker rooms. They had coexisted without incident for years, but the two men had a falling out over social and political views that both of them aired publicly online. And they landed on different sides of conversations that had nothing to do with the wrestling business. And once those positions were made public and visible to everyone watching, the friendship was over. In January 20 2020, Jericho was hosting his cruise. The Rock and Roll Wrestling Rager at Sea is an annual event he organizes, bringing together wrestlers and fans on a ship for several days of shows, parties, and general chaos. It is the kind of environment where the professional and the personal blur together constantly, where people who do not normally spend extended time with each other suddenly cannot avoid each other for days at a stretch. MVP was reportedly also on board. According to reports that circulated widely through the wrestling media, there was a confrontation between the two men during the cruise. Jericho reportedly had been saying things that pushed too far, mouthing off in a way that escalated beyond what MVP was willing to absorb. MVP allegedly knocked him out. The story was that Jericho had talked himself directly into a situation he was not prepared to finish. Jericho never publicly confirmed the specific details of what happened that night, but the account spread through wrestling circles at a speed that suggested it had credibility, and it painted a picture of a man whose mouth consistently writes checks that the rest of him struggles to cash. The heat between them did not end on the cruise. In 2022, the two men crossed paths again. This time the setting was a hotel lobby. MVP reportedly stood in front of Jericho and made it plain that if Jericho wanted to settle their disagreement, they could step outside and do it. Jericho's response was to call MVP a jobber and then turn around, walk to the elevator, step in, and leave. Picture that scene carefully. A man who has built an entire professional persona around being the most confident, most charismatic, and toughest figure in any room he enters, calling someone a jobber and then pressing a button to escape through a closing door. That image does not hold together. The persona and the behavior are telling two different stories. To be fair, accepting an invitation to a physical confrontation in a hotel lobby is not a reasonable expectation for any professional. The lobby is not a place for that kind of thing, and walking away from an unreasonable invitation is not automatically cowardice. But the full arc of this conflict does tell a coherent story about how Jericho operates. He escalates verbally. He makes pointed comments. He says things that are clearly designed to provoke. And when the provocation works and someone is standing directly in front of him wanting to respond, he locates the nearest exit and disappears through it. On the cruise, he mouthed off to the wrong person and faced the consequences immediately. In the hotel lobby, he found his words and then found his elevator. The pattern is the same both times. In 2024, something finally changed. MVP debuted in All Elite Wrestling, the promotion where Jericho had been one of the founding names since the company launched. When MVP arrived, rather than let the old conflict immediately poison their professional environment, he went directly to Jericho's locker room and asked for a conversation. He wanted to clear the air. He wanted to move forward like adults and put years of accumulated bad blood behind them. They talked. They reached a professional reconciliation. Whatever had built up over years of social media disagreements, a cruise ship altercation, and a hotel lobby standoff was set aside enough for two professionals to work in the same company. That is the right ending to a story that could have continued escalating indefinitely. Both men deserve credit for reaching it, but notice who had to make the first move. MVP had to walk into Jericho's space, knock on his door, and ask for peace. Jericho received that gesture. He was not the one who initiated it. He never is. So number 9 is Brock Lesnar. The SummerSlam 2016 confrontation is one of the most famous backstage incidents of the modern era in professional wrestling. It is the story that people point to most often when they talk about Jericho as a locker room leader. And it is also the story that, if you look at it from a different angle, tells you the most about how Jericho positions himself within every conflict he enters. Brock Lesnar was in the main event of SummerSlam that night against Randy Orton. The finish of that match became immediately controversial. Lesnar delivered real elbow strikes to Orton's head in a way designed to open a legitimate cut without a blade. Orton bled heavily. The visual was brutal. The broadcast showed it clearly to millions of viewers on it, and it became the defining conversation in professional wrestling for the following week. Jericho was backstage, standing in the area known as the gorilla position. That is the staging area right behind the entrance curtain, the last point before a performer goes out, and the first point where they return when they come back. It is a narrow, high-traffic space where almost everyone in the company passes through during a major show. Jericho watched what Lesnar was doing to Orton from that vantage point. He did not know that the brutal finish had been arranged and approved in advance. He did not know the elbows were part of the plan. Looking at what was happening on screen, he believed that Lesnar had decided to abandon the scripted finish and was genuinely hurting a man who had no mechanism to defend himself in front of a live crowd. And when Lesnar came back through the curtain, Jericho was already there waiting for him. What followed was a nose-to-nose confrontation. Jericho got directly directly in Lesnar's face and challenged him. He made it clear that what he had witnessed was not acceptable and that there needed to be an accounting for it. Jericho later admitted publicly that if Lesnar had swung at him first, his plan was to bite Lesnar's nose off. Not to punch him, not to wrestle him, to bite his nose off. That detail is one of the most repeated lines in this story because it is specific, extreme, and very easy to remember. Lesnar responded with homophobic slurs. That made an already volatile situation significantly worse. Triple H and Vince McMahon both had to step in and physically put themselves between the two men before the confrontation became something that could not be managed or contained. There is a genuine version of this story where Jericho deserves real credit. He stood in front of Brock Lesnar, a man who is by all accounts one of the most legitimately dangerous individuals to ever work in professional wrestling, and he demanded that Lesnar answer for what he had done. The overwhelming majority of the locker room saw what happened to Orton and said nothing to Lesnar directly. They had very good reasons for that choice. Lesnar is not someone most people want to confront. Jericho said something. He did it for a friend. He did it because he believed in a standard of conduct that he thought had been violated. That is not nothing. But there is a version of this story that deserves honest examination as well. Jericho chose the loudest, most visible, most theatrical location available for this confrontation. The gorilla position during a major pay-per-view is the single most populated backstage spot at any WWE event. Half the roster passes through it. Jericho positioned himself there and waited. He could have gone to management. He could have found a quiet moment later in the evening to have a direct conversation. He could have waited until he understood the full context of what had happened. Instead, he made the confrontation into a public event that the entire locker room witnessed in real time. And then Lesnar responded with slurs, which meant that Jericho, already standing as the moral hero defending his friend, only also became the sympathetic victim of an ugly personal attack. He walked away from the incident with the credit for standing up and the sympathy for how he was spoken to. Both stories all in one scene. The pattern where Jericho creates the most dramatic possible confrontation and then benefits both from initiating it and from how the other person responds shows up too consistently to be coincidence. Lesnar never apologized. There was no reconciliation waiting at the end of the story. The heat just stayed exactly where it landed. Number 8 is Bill Goldberg. The conflict with Goldberg ran across 2 major promotions and the better part of a decade. Not for it. That kind of timeline tells you something important about how much material there was to burn through on both sides. In 1998, Jericho was a rising performer in World Championship Wrestling, skilled, improving on the microphone every week, and smart enough to recognize an opportunity when he saw one. Goldberg was carrying the longest undefeated streak WCW had ever built. The entire product was organized around that streak. Goldberg was the centerpiece. Every booking decision flowed around the need to keep his record intact and his image invincible. Jericho looked at that structure and decided to attach himself to it. He launched what became known as the conspiracy victim storyline. He started challenging Goldberg on camera, timing his challenges for moments when Goldberg was not physically in the building. He mocked the champion. He held up fake versions of Goldberg's championship belt. He built an elaborate comedic persona around the conceit that Goldberg was afraid to face him. Week after week, the bit landed. The audience found it genuinely entertaining. Jericho was generating real crowd reactions from a comedic angle in a division that rarely produced that kind of heat. It was creative, it was clever, and it was working. Goldberg despised it. Hulk Hogan despised it. Eric Bischoff, who controlled the creative direction of WCW at that time, viewed it with contempt. Jericho was a cruiserweight doing comedy bits that made the most protected main event star in the company look like the butt of a joke, and the people in power saw that as a threat to the entire structure they had built. Rather than give Jericho the pay-per-view match that the angle had clearly been building toward, WCW ended the feud by having Goldberg physically attack Jericho in a segment. No competitive match, no proper story conclusion, just a power move that reminded everyone where Jericho stood in the hierarchy. The creative momentum that both Jericho and the audience had invested in was discarded. Jericho was livid. He believed real opportunity had been deliberately thrown away, and he was right about that. The decision was a significant factor in him choosing to leave WCW entirely. But the Goldberg story was not finished. When Goldberg signed with WWE in 2003, the two were suddenly sharing the same locker room again. On Goldberg's very first day with the company, reports circulated that he had complained about Jericho to Kevin Nash. Goldberg told Nash that Jericho was not selling correctly during a match, that Jericho was being uncooperative and making Goldberg look bad. Those complaints were traveling through the locker room through back channels before Jericho even knew they were being made. Jericho found out, and he did not go to management. He did not request a formal meeting. He walked directly into the dressing room, stood in front of Goldberg, and told him to say to Jericho's face whatever he had been saying to Nash Nash behind Jericho's back. Goldberg grabbed him by the throat. Jericho applied a front face lock and brought Goldberg to the ground. He wrapped his legs around Goldberg's body to control the much larger man and prevent him from using his size advantage. The altercation moved from the dressing room into the hallway, where it became visible to fans who were standing in the area. Booker T, Arn Anderson, Christian, Hurricane, and Terry Taylor were all present and witnessed the fight. Eventually, it was broken up. Goldberg apologized afterward. He apologized for the fight itself and for the words he had directed at Jericho during it. The two became unexpectedly cordial. They shared rides on Goldberg's private plane. The physical confrontation functioned as the thing that cleared years of accumulated resentment between them. Much later, they sat down together on Jericho's own podcast and apologized to each other publicly, which was a genuinely decent moment. But follow the logic of what Jericho chose to do. Someone talked about him in a conversation he was not present for. Rather than let management handle it or have a measured professional conversation, Kanahi walked into a room and forced a confrontation with a man who was genuinely dangerous. He lit the match himself. The outcome happened to go his way, and the fight happened to clear the air. But lighting a match deliberately and having things work out does not make lighting the match a good idea. Number 7 is Triple H. Jericho's debut in the World Wrestling Federation in August of 1999 stands as one of the most celebrated in the company's history. He interrupted a live segment on pay-per-view. The crowd responded immediately and enormously. The moment was electric. On every indication in that room on that night suggested that Chris Jericho was about to become one of the most important performers in professional wrestling. That did not happen quickly, and the most significant reason it did not happen quickly had a name. Triple H was the most politically connected performer in WWE at that time. He was the central figure in a group of performers called the Clique, which had dominated the political landscape of WWE's locker room for years. The Clique looked after its members, pushed back hard against outsiders it perceived as threats, and had a well-established reputation for controlling who moved up and who stayed put. When a new performer came in hot, with momentum and crowd support and obvious upside, that was not something the Clique celebrated. That was something it managed. Jericho, with his massive debut and his immediate crowd responses, was exactly the kind of performer the Clique watched for. The response was quiet but consistent. His ideas were mocked by veterans. His character was criticized in the locker room. He was treated not as someone who had just delivered one of the most impressive debuts in the company's history, but as an interloper who had not yet earned the right to be standing where he was. The moment that captures this period most clearly is a phone call. Early in his WWE tenure, Jericho needed to find his way to a venue and called Triple H for directions. Triple H told him to get a map and hung up. Jericho could hear other members of DX laughing in the background before the line went dead. That is the story in a single exchange. You are not one of us. You are not someone we help. Just know where you stand and stay there. That exchange sounds trivial, but in a locker room where the question of who is respected and who is not has direct consequences for a performer's career, being laughed at by the top guy and his crew is not a minor thing. It is information. It tells you exactly how you are being seen and what you can expect from that quarter. For years into the early 2000s, Triple H reportedly used his influence to ensure Jericho remained below the top tier consistently. Jericho has been candid about this. He has said plainly that by 2002, the two genuinely did not like each other. They did eventually work it out. As Triple H transitioned away from being an active in-ring competitor and into an executive role within the company, the competitive pressure that had fueled the animosity simply faded. When there are no spots to compete for, the politics around those spots lose their urgency. Jericho has acknowledged that they now share genuine mutual respect, that reconciliation is real. But for the period when it mattered most, Triple H was the ceiling above Jericho's head, and Jericho spent enormous amounts of energy resenting the man holding it in place rather than finding ways to work around or through the system. Number 6, Chyna. In 1999, Jericho was placed into an Intercontinental Championship program with Chyna. Before the program began, Vince McMahon gave Jericho a personal instruction. Treat Chyna like one of the boys. Do not hold back. Work with her at full intensity the way you would with any male performer. The instruction was clear and it came from the top. Jericho took it seriously. He committed to making the program work. He put genuine effort into carrying the matches, making Chyna look credible, and building a story that felt like a legitimate athletic competition. He was doing his job exactly the way he had been told to do it. Then he accidentally gave Chyna a black eye during a match. Vince McMahon's reaction was the exact opposite of the instruction he had given Jericho. McMahon screamed at him. He demanded to know how Jericho could do such a thing. He made it very clear that Chyna was a woman and should be treated accordingly. The instruction to treat her like one of the boys was gone, replaced by the direct opposite, and Jericho was standing in the blast radius of a contradiction that he had not created and could not resolve. Jericho was taken to the hallway and told to apologize. He did it. When he described the apology afterward as insincere, he felt humiliated in a very specific way. The humiliation of being punished for following instructions exactly, with no acknowledgement that the instructions themselves were the problem. The rules had changed without warning, and there was nothing he could say or do about it. But there was a larger, colder dimension to this situation. Chyna was in a relationship with Triple H. For Jericho, already on the wrong side of Triple H's political influence, that connection was not a neutral fact. It meant that any friction involving Chyna could be filtered directly back through the most powerful figure in the locker room. Any complaint, any awkwardness, any fallout from the incident with the black eye, all of it had a direct line to someone who was already working against Jericho's interests. And Jericho began to view Chyna as a political enemy, not because of who she was as an individual, but because of who she was connected to and what that connection meant inside the specific power structure of WWE at that time. The locker room is not a neutral space. Alliances and relationships carry weight, and being associated with the right person can protect you in ways that have nothing to do with your work. Being associated with the wrong person can expose you in the same way. For Jericho, Chyna was Triple H's person inside a story that was already going badly for him. Both the Triple H and Chyna stories revealed Jericho at his most reactive. He did not create the unfair double standard with Chyna. Vince McMahon created it with contradictory instructions. He did not invent the gatekeeping from the Clique, and that system had been operating for years before he arrived. But Jericho's consistent response to both was to personalize everything, to add more names to a list that was already getting long, and to carry each new injury as permanent evidence that the system had been specifically designed to stop him. Number 5 is Scott Hall. These stories belong to World Championship Wrestling in the mid to late 1990s, when the New World Order ran the locker room with as much authority as they ran the television product. Scott Hall was a primary source of backstage bullying in that environment, and Jericho was one of his regular targets. Hall reportedly used his political standing to undermine younger talent as a matter of routine, and Jericho's growing popularity made him a visible target. Hall reportedly told Jericho directly face-to-face that nobody paid to see him. That statement is not simply an insult. Said in a professional wrestling locker room by someone with Hall's standing, it is a targeted message designed to damage a performer's sense of worth and their willingness to fight for better opportunities. If Jericho absorbed that message and let it affect how he carried himself, it would show up everywhere. In his confidence on the microphone, in how aggressively he pushed for creative investment, in whether he believed his own momentum was real or borrowed, and Hall understood exactly what those words were for and exactly how to use them. The dynamic shifted when Scott Norton, who had worked alongside Jericho in Japan and had seen the locker room dynamic clearly, advised him directly. Norton told Jericho that the only way to stop Hall was to stand in front of him and refuse to move. The next time Hall tried to push him around, Jericho confronted him directly and made it plain that he was prepared for whatever came next. Hall backed down. That moment was genuinely important. It gave Jericho the confidence that the WCW locker room did not have to break him. It established that he could stand his ground when it mattered, but it also gave him a story, a clear and simple story about the establishment trying to diminish him and failing, that he carried forward as the foundational proof of everything he was fighting against. Number 4 is Kevin Nash. Kevin Nash was the intellectual architecture of the same problem. Nash coined the phrase vanilla midgets to describe smaller, technically skilled performers like Jericho, Eddie Guerrero, and Chris Benoit. The argument he made was that performers of this type were actively harmful to the wrestling business. They drew attention and promotional resources toward wrestlers who did not have the larger-than-life physical presence that Nash believed audiences truly paid to see. By emphasizing cruiserweights and technical wrestlers, Nash argued WCW was eroding the spectacle that made professional wrestling worth watching in the first place. Nash did not just have an opinion, he had genuine backstage influence in WCW. How and his ideology translated directly into booking decisions and the way talent was positioned and valued. The Vanilla Midgets label carried real weight because the person using it had the power to make it stick. The long-term outcome went in exactly the opposite direction Nash predicted. Modern professional wrestling became built around precisely the kind of performer Nash dismissed. Technical skill, character depth, and the ability to tell complex stories in the ring became the fundamental currency of the business. Jericho was on the correct side of that argument, and history made that clear. But Jericho still reaches back to those WCW years as permanent evidence of what he was forced to overcome. At some point, continuing to tell the story of a war you have already won stops being about preserving memory and starts being about maintaining an identity. Jericho constructed a core part of how he sees himself around the idea of being the performer who survived when the gatekeepers tried to stop him. That identity was forged in those WCW years, and he has never fully let it rest. Number 3 is Vampiro. This story takes us to Mexico, back to the early years of Jericho's career, when he was working under the name Corazon de Leon in the promotion then called EMLL, which would later become CMLL. Jericho was young, developing his craft, learning the specific mechanics and rhythms of lucha libre, and trying to build a name in a culture and a wrestling territory that were completely foreign to him. Vampiro was already established there long before Jericho arrived, a Canadian who had done the difficult and genuinely impressive work of connecting with a Mexican audience and becoming a real star in their eyes. Vampiro had achieved something that very few foreign performers manage in any territory. He was the example of what was possible. He had built real popularity in a place that was not built for people like him. When Jericho arrived and began getting pushed by the promotion, the dynamic shifted. According to Jericho, Vampiro's attitude changed as that push developed. Jericho accused Vampiro of presenting one face publicly while working against him in private, on not using his established position and his relationships within the promotion to put doubt in the minds of the people making decisions about where investment should go. Jericho believed Vampiro saw another Canadian gaining momentum in the same territory as a direct threat to the unique space he had worked hard to occupy. Foreign spots in any territory are limited and fiercely competed for. Vampiro had built his position carefully over years of real work, and Jericho's rising profile was a direct challenge to the space he occupied. Vampiro's response to Jericho's accusations has been completely consistent across every interview and conversation where the subject has come up. He has said that Jericho was insignificant to him at the time, that he barely remembered Jericho's presence in Mexico, that the rivalry and the sabotage that Jericho has been describing publicly for years was not something Vampiro was even aware of while it was supposedly happening. That response is either the most brutally honest account you could give or the most devastating possible dismissal, depending on which side of it you stand on. Either way, it carries a very specific meaning. Jericho built this story into part of his career narrative. The young performer, far from home, trying to break through while an already established name worked quietly against him behind the scenes. The underdog versus the threatened incumbent, the pattern that appears in every chapter of his career. But if the man who was cast as the antagonist of that chapter cannot clearly remember Jericho being in the building, you have to ask a serious question. Jericho has always been the most important character in his own story. In the Mexico chapter, Vampiro was barely a supporting role. Number 2 is Larry Zbyszko. This conflict moved entirely out of the wrestling world and into an actual legal proceeding. In 2001, Jericho was working in WWE using the character name Larger Than Life Living Legend. Larry Zbyszko had used the Living Legend moniker during his famous feud with Bruno Sammartino in the 1980s, and he filed a lawsuit claiming that Jericho and WWE were infringing on what he considered an established professional identity that belonged to him. There is something almost absurd about the idea of two wrestlers going to court over a nickname, but Zbyszko pursued it as a serious legal matter, and Jericho had to respond to it whether he found it ridiculous or not. He found it very ridiculous, and he was not quiet about that opinion. In his book Undisputed, Jericho called Zbyszko the single worst commentator in wrestling history and described the lawsuit as lame. He made no effort to hide his contempt for either the legal action or the man who filed it. He was not going to be respectful about something he believed was a waste of everyone's time. Zbyszko did not absorb this quietly. In 2011, years after the lawsuit had been filed and was still dragging forward, he publicly fired back at Jericho. He mocked Jericho's height in interviews and challenged him to a shoot fight, a real unscripted physical confrontation, to resolve things the old-fashioned way. The challenge sounded theatrical and was not taken seriously as a genuine proposition. The legal matter eventually ended in what both sides described as a double knockout. Number 1 is Ken Shamrock. Of all the names on this countdown, this one is the quietest. There was no famous incident with witnesses, no fight that moved from a dressing room into a hallway, no legal proceeding with filings and settlements. The tension between Jericho and Shamrock was built on something more fundamental than any of those things, and in some ways that makes it the most revealing entry on the entire list. Shamrock came from legitimate combat. Before professional wrestling, he was a world champion in mixed martial arts. His fighting background was authentic in a way that very few professional wrestlers could claim. Jericho approached the craft from a completely different foundation. He was a performer and a storyteller. He built matches around character work, crowd psychology, and the emotional arc of what the audience was experiencing. The theatrical dimension of the match mattered as much as the physical execution. The word selling, meaning how a performer reacts to their opponent's offense to make it feel real, was something Jericho approached as part of storytelling rather than as physical submission. Those two philosophies colliding produced friction. The disagreement between them was over how matches should feel, what level of physical intensity was appropriate for a theatrical format, and what good professional wrestling actually looked like from the inside. These are not trivial questions. They are the fundamental questions that define the craft, and two performers who answer them in completely different ways are going to have a very hard time working together. The result was ongoing professional conflict, not a blow-up, not an incident that generated media coverage, just a persistent incompatibility that made their interactions in the ring difficult and their relationship in the locker room cool. Here is what all of this adds up to. Wrestling applies pressure that almost no other profession creates. The road schedule is relentless. The competition for a small number of meaningful opportunities is constant. The physical and emotional demands of the work are extreme. And everything happens inside a closed professional environment where the people at the top control nearly everything and the people trying to get there have very little leverage. He outlasted nearly every person who tried to slow him down. He proved the gatekeepers wrong in multiple promotions across multiple decades, but he also held grudges past the point where they helped him. He made enemies out of situations that did not have to end that way. And he narrated his own story in a way that always made him the most important person in every room, even the rooms where the power was held by someone else entirely. Chris Jericho is talented, complicated, resilient, and one of the most layered figures the wrestling world has ever produced. Leave a comment with your thoughts below, subscribe so you do not miss the next one, and hit the like button on your way out.